All right, everybody, we are back live again. So this is like probably one of those very few days when we have two back-to-back live streams. And welcome to Philo Sapiens, where religion meets reason. And today we have almost full strength, pretty much the full strength of the days of your, basically, if you want to call it. So we have again, since yesterday Khali was missing and he wanted to contribute. Basically, there was a glitch in his laptop that prevented him from joining. But he'll tell you the reason. And maybe he won't. Basically, but then we decided that we anyways wanted to, do part two of the review of Islam Hakim and Faisal's conversation on contingency argument, and we said, okay, let's have it again today. We all had some time, and so here we are. So first of all, welcome Khali, welcome Modin. How are you two doing?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you, Gandhi?
I am good. Thank you, Philo. And yeah, I was apologizing to you guys earlier for not being able to make it yesterday due to a reason that let me not mention it all
Let's not
online.
discuss.
Yeah, but yeah, I wanted to join. In fact, I was a bit. I mean, I had all these points written down, and I did want to discuss the stream because I think there were many things many lackings and many interesting points that I wanted to discuss. So hopefully, somehow I'll be able to sneak them in today's discussion.
So yeah, with that intro, I think Khali, one thing I want to ask you: where should we start? If you have seen that, that discussion between Islam Hakim and Faisal, basically,
I have.
initially they are discussing about the normal logic that we deal with, and then the paraconsistent logic. And I thought that in conversation was pretty interesting, by the way. But I'm not sure if you want to start there, or do you straight away want to jump where Fazal asked that question to Hakim, which one is your favorite version of contingency argument, or which one you think has the least flaws, basically.
Yeah, it was interesting how Faisal even put that question to Hakim.
Yeah,
He
I
didn't even
pointed
ask.
that out. Yeah, I pointed
Yeah,
that out to Madin. That's interesting because he's saying that okay, none of them pass through straight away.
exactly. And which it seems rather, I don't know, maybe very honest of them. But that was the only honest part, I would say, from Faisal's side. But Hakim, I think, strangely enough, maybe it's not strange, but you see, at least to me, it was strange that someone who's trying to, or who staunchly believes in God, would agree that there are other logically valid, explanations, but he just prefers the one that he believes in. That is the God explanation. So just I think I found Hakim to be a bit more honest, and it was very interesting, and I wanted to discuss that. But yeah, I think even that I think the contingency argument discussion is what I'm interested in because the para-consistent logic and the other points that he again that Hakim discussed or mentioned. I think that discussion was interesting. I didn't find anything there to disagree with, or at least I don't recall anything. Maybe there was something, but I think it seemed reasonable enough what they were
I
talking
think
about.
okay. I'll say this one thing that I disagreed with. He said, and Hakim said, and maybe I'm mistaken, and maybe I misunderstood it. He said that even if in some alternate universe, paraconsistent logic existed, we'll still judge that the things happening in that uh, world by our own logic of this world, basically. And I disagreed, basically. I mean, you can judge it basically, but it doesn't mean that that thing has to apply to that universe, probably, right? And that's in a universe where paraconsistent logic is the norm. You just can't say anything about that universe from our armchair thinking, basically. I mean, you just can't see, you just can't talk too much about the metaphysical world from the laws that we have from our universe, from our armchair. forget about that universe with paraconsistent logic, basically, right? So I thought that was a point that I wanted to highlight. So I have done that. Maybe you agree with that. Maybe you disagree. Probably you need to hear what he said to even
I do,
comment on
I
it.
do
Yeah.
recall that point that you're mentioning, but here is where I should come very clean.
Hmm.
I barely know anything about paraconsistent logic. I read about it very little, and
Mhm.
based on what I read, I think what he was saying seemed reasonable. But maybe
Yeah.
Mahadan and you can discuss it a bit more. But because I am very bad, I have basically no knowledge about paraconsistent logic. I know the very basic kind of logic that we employ usually, the three rules of logic. But I don't.
Right. Right.
I have not read too much about the paraconsistent logic and the frameworks that, um, you know, the examples
Yeah.
that I read about the paraconsistent logic. They, I don't know. I don't think I've read that much about it to even point out the mistake in that. But if you guys do think there was a mistake, maybe you guys can discuss it.
I mean,
I don't
I
think you
just
guys discussed it
I
yesterday,
pointed
right?
out from, yeah, I pointed out from the sheer, outside look of paraconsistent logic, not delving deep into it, basically. I mean, yes, I can say that with very honest, it's just an armchair thinking as well.
Yeah.
It's not something that I have, I'll say that I have considered an example, and based on that example, I have disagreed with him. I don't
I
think
find
so.
it
I
very
mean,
strange. I mean, based on what it seems to be the paraconsistent logic and and those frameworks, I find it very strange. I'm not able to maybe comprehend if that the very the apparent what they apparently mean. But when I read about it, it seemed that it's not even talking about something different from the basic rules of logic. I don't know. I don't want to go into too much detail, but you know, not thinking about something which would contradict the three rules of logic or any one of them. I think I find it very strange to think about that. How would you even think about it? So
right,
yeah,
Madan, you want to add something to it, or
maybe
shall
if
we
Mahadan
just
can add something
jump?
on.
Uh,
Oh, I mean, I'd rather watch the video and see what they're talking about, really, because I don't know what they're talking about. Where
okay,
paraconsistent?
let's see if do you want to go into that paraconsistent logic, or shall we start with the
To be honest,
contingency?
I'm mainly
Let's
interested in the contingency argument, right?
yeah. I think let's continue that, and then
Let's
we can go
continue
back
the
to that.
contingency. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Each and every one of these ideas when you put them together.
Yeah, I think the underlying one is really the modal structure. If you were to write these out in terms of your modal symbols, all you'll see is boxes and diamonds next to brackets and P in place.
About this before. You speak of basically. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll try and give. I mean, really, I need sort of a without missing any details, but I'll try and give a high level kind of view.
Can
what you
pause it?
essentially have is the box.
Are you going to restart that discussion? I mean, what you reviewed yesterday, even. Are you going to review it again?
No, you wanted to add some points. Basically,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
was running for you, basically, right? Because you wanted to, because we have done that part. So if you want to jump straight ahead to where we left, then we can do that as well. But
You can
then,
just move to the point where you have already up to the point where you've already covered,
yeah,
and
I forgot where we
I'll add in
started.
my points, because I think they will. Faisal has already written many of those points, and I have many of the points written as well. So I'll add in everything that I want to add without you repeating the entire video. I think that
Okay,
would be,
okay. So will just
people might not
completely
like it.
skip to where we left off
Yeah.
yesterday.
Let's
Okay,
go there.
okay. I don't even remember where we left off, basically. Martin, do you remember at what point we left off?
Yeah, it was Faisal. He gave Islam Hakim gave the three solutions. We were there. Remember? So just look for the three solutions to pop up on the page. There we
to do that
go.
in the first place, because
I think
really
I think
point
before
of all this is
And
to
I think
connect with
most people.
someone.
before we go in
Sorry?
there, and I think before again we start discussing those three possibilities that Islam Hakim has mentioned. I think just what I wanted to add, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. The basic disagreement or the basic problem that I have with the argument that Islam has already presented, I just wanted to highlight that. And I think you've already covered it, but I just wanted to summarize, maybe in a summarized manner, mention my contentions. The first premise that he mentions, which is premise number one, I think it's that contingent things exist, right? I think I recall that to be the first premise. Yeah, contingent beings exist. Now, when Islam is mentioned, the first premise, and I think you already covered it, but just want to summarize, summarize my contention. When he mentioned this first premise, there the definition of contingent being that he's using is that beings that rely on something else for their existence. So, in other words, dependent beings, you could say. So, over here in this first premise, what he has simply defined a contingent being as is something that depends on another for its existence, meaning it is not self-sufficient in terms of its existence. So, I think I'm fine with this definition.
Yeah, I think
If
he defines it in premise 2, right? I
exactly,
mean, that gives you the definition.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. So that is
yeah,
where he defines it. That which a
yeah.
contingent being depends upon. But it's a bit different. If you go to the premise two, he says that how a contingent being sort of depends, but he has not made it exclusively that. It just says that which a contingent being depends upon must exist if the contingent being exists. So yes, you could
Yeah, yeah. I
take
mean,
it,
it's more
but
of an implied
yeah,
definition rather than a
yeah.
straightforward.
I mean,
Yeah,
someone could say that, no, this is not a definition. This is not the only thing that a contingent being means. One could say
yeah.
that. But the thing
Right.
is that Islam, in the first premise, if we are accepting that first premise, at least me, I am only accepting that premise because how he has defined contingent being is something that depends on another for its existence. And I'm fine with that, that there are such things, I think. I agree with that. Now, seemingly, there seems to be such things. So now the problem is that this is how he defines the contingent being in this first premise. Now, when he goes to, I think it's the fifth premise where he seems to be implying that, if there is no, if P implies Q, or I think he used the word C, I think it was B being the necessary being, and B implies C, which is being the necessary being implies creation directly without any agency or without any modality. I think that's what you call it. Without anything being possible, without any possibility of it not being the way that way. Then suddenly he has changed his definition of contingency and have added another dimension to it. He have added another dimension of the contingency, that is a contingent being is also something which could be any other way. Now, and what you have said is that if something is a necessary effect of another cause, let's say necessary being, if something comes out of it necessarily or is caused from the necessary being necessarily, then that thing will also become necessary because it could not be any other way. But then he says, oh, but we already agreed in the first premise that the contingent beings exist. Now there lies in, I think, the very basic problem that he has, which is in the first premise he defined contingent being as something which depends on another for its existence, and the seeming contradiction that he has highlighted is that the things are now no longer, I mean, in this worldview, at least, unless you according to him, if you employ the agency possibility that the necessary being has agency, he's saying that without agency everything would become necessary because they could not be any other way. Now that is another definition of contingent being. This is not what we agreed in the first premise. So here he is using the word contingent in two different ways, and then come and saying that there's a contradiction. So I think that is the biggest problem that I see with his argument. I just wanted to highlight that. And I think you guys did cover that, but I think that was the biggest problem. I think so. But besides the other problems, do you guys agree with that? And I think for Philo, you touched it. You said, I think it's called the equivocation fallacy, where you use the same word, but
Yeah,
it has actually different meanings, and you're
Yes,
it's
using it
equivocation
with one
basically.
meaning in one place and another meaning in another place, right? It's
Exactly,
called the
exactly.
equivocation fallacy, right? And that's what
Yeah,
he's doing.
yeah,
I think you
yeah.
started with that, and I just wanted to clarify that this is what he's doing.
Right, right. He's being yeah. He's we did highlight that. All right, Martin, do you wanted to
By
add
the way,
something? Yeah.
Yeah, I think
By the
so.
way,
We did mention that they were not very clear what they're talking about in defining things.
no, I think they
Because,
were clear. Mahathir, I think they were clear.
Hmm.
At least Hakim was clear, but he, I don't know, maybe deliberately made it, confused it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's what I
Yeah,
kind of
okay.
mean.
Okay, that's what you mean. Okay.
Like
Okay.
a little bit muddled in their thinking, right? Because they came out with they mentioned dependency at the beginning, then they mentioned dependency in the argument, and then but then they kind of moved to modality at some point. And we didn't mention that, Philo, yesterday, didn't we? Like the mixing modality with with these without articulating it properly, and therefore they're very unclear what they're talking about. Because when Hakim mentioned free will, he was trying to show that there can be alternative possibilities or something, right? Because of the free it's not necessary. God's free will makes it such that it avoids the modal collapse or something like that. And so they touched upon modality, then they kind of ignored modality. They didn't mention modality in the argument, and then they kind of snuck it back.
Yeah, and then that's we highlighted that they weren't really sure which contingency were the tackling. Basically, they started from dependency contingency, and then they touched upon modality contingency. Then Faisal wanted to touch upon the causal contingency. The only thing that I didn't see there was the temporal contingency, probably, but I must have just skipped it, basically, right? So anyway, one thing I realized very, probably I didn't see it yesterday. I was too busy. Kylie, you are there.
Yeah.
You are there basically, right? You're living rent free in their heads, basically.
Not in their head, but on their stream.
But on their machines, at least.
I was actually
in
just
their
going
heads,
to
perhaps as well. Right?
I was going to just bring up that point that did you get a chance, Philo, to listen to that? Right? I guess you listened to my discussion with.
I did, and I thought we should do that review of that.
If you notice, this is the exact same argument that Hakim actually discussed with me.
No, and that exact was the exact same problem he got stuck with, basically.
And I just the moment because he was confusing this contingency and all of that. And Faisal has this very good habit of starting to write things down. But what I noticed, he wasn't writing anything down that Islam was saying. He was just writing down what I was saying.
Right.
And so what I did is I told Faisal, okay, just wait a second. Write this. Let's be very clear on the definition of that. Is Mahathir, you might not have listened to it, but actually I told him this very thing. Okay, let's be very clear on what contingent beings mean and how I have used it, because he was making the same argument. It would be necessary, the whole set of these. If everything possible exists, then it would become necessary because there is P implies Q, and there is no possibility of something being another way. And I said, so what's wrong with that? Maybe everything is the way it is, and it could not be any other way. I have no problem with that. Why is that impossible? No, then it would not be, but it would not be contingent then and all of that. So I said, okay, just wait, Faisal, can you just write this down? Definition of contingent being that I am agreeing with is this: something that depends on another for its existence is a contingent being. And he wrote it down, and he didn't have any problem with that at the time. And I said, necessary being is someone which does not depend on any other thing, which is self-sufficient for its existence. And then I said, okay, now the response to your argument is that something which despite it not being, it could not possibly be any other way, could still be contingent, because how we define contingency, at least how I've defined it, is that it would still depend for its existence on the necessary being. And then suddenly Faisal was like, oh, you are using contingency, the definition of contingency, in a very non-standard way. This is not how it is generally defined. And Islam said, but Islam actually, his concern was
this is sorry to cut you off there. Okay. This is exactly how Thomas Aquinas defines it, and his second way, basically. And this is exactly what Ghazali does. This is exactly what Ghazali picks it up from Aquinas.
Exactly,
right?
My definition was
this is in their books. This is in their
exactly.
philosopher have written on this, basically, right? and they agree with it basically.
They
And
agree with it, yeah.
That's the definition they have to use. Even Ibn Sina used this basically, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
Ibn
yeah.
Sina, started from Ibn Sina to Thomas Aquinas to Ghazali and all those guys basically, right? So yeah, I mean, I don't
Yeah.
understand. All of a sudden, as soon as you find your undies in a twist, basically you just start to discard it.
Yeah. Because I
Sorry,
clearly asked, yeah,
I shouldn't have used that idiom, by the way.
yeah, because I clearly asked Faisal to just write us down. Now, everything was on black and white now. Like, this is how we define contingent being. So what's the problem with now? What's the problem with something being caused by, depending on another? Why are you still calling it contingent if this is the definition of contingent being? Now, Islam, unless he clearly, I think he was forced but he still didn't do. He didn't actually define or clarify that no because if he actually believed in it, then he should have defined that no, contingent being means something that depends on another for its existence, as well as something that could possibly be another way. Both of these things should be there for it to be contingent. Now, if Islam had actually pointed that out and then made his argument, then I would have stopped at premise one, that no, then I disagree with the premise one. How do you know? That's because then I would have asked him, how do you know that there are things which could be any other way? How are you aware of this already? Can you prove that? Because there is no possible way for them to prove that
Exactly.
there,
I
there,
think
there are things
that's a
which could be
very
any other way. They
strong
cannot
argument.
actually prove it. There's no
No, they
possible
can't.
way for them to
They
do
just
it.
can't. There's no other way to do this.
The big mistake, the big kind of mistake that's happened here is that Islam Hakim was initially talking about the modal contingency argument and trying to maintain consistency with that one by introducing
Yeah.
free will, right? But then when they started writing things down, they started talking about
Yeah.
contingency.
Yeah.
And that
No,
was
Exactly.
Madin
No,
had
but
muddled it. He muddled with
he
it. He
muddled it.
started with
He began with
dependency,
he began with
and then
dependency causality.
he tried
Sorry,
to
contingency.
inject the he
yeah.
tried to inject modal contingency halfway through it. Basically, you have
Maybe I can't remember
yeah.
exactly how they started. I remember
I mean,
I
that's the
remember they
question.
mentioned.
The very
No, I
first
know this
question.
because I've
The
dealt
very
with it twice now.
the very first question that was asked by Faisal to him was, which one is your favorite? And then probably he stopped in between and he said, no, which one do you find least problems with, or something of that sort. So I'm just not quoting him properly,
I would
but
like to
he
actually,
started off with dependency basically.
yeah, I'm not asking to watch it now, but I would actually like to see
I agree.
that beginning.
No, I agree.
Yeah,
I've listened to it carefully. Philo is right. He started
Yeah.
with dependency contingency.
Yeah, because why is he then talking about modal issues regarding we need free will?
No, he turned to modal
That's the
issues
problem with
once
his
he
argument.
turned to the necessary
That's the
being,
problem with
and
his
then he had
argument.
to that's
Yeah,
the problem
he's
basically.
just suddenly going to that modal contingency because that's
Yes.
what he needs to prove agency
Yeah.
somehow. He wants to he has to add this in because he wants to bring in agency.
No, and then
You know,
he has to say that not all things are necessary from a modal perspective.
from a
Basically,
modal perspective, exactly.
he has to deny that modal perspective necessariness to contingent things that are quote unquote dependent on the necessary being, basically, right?
Yeah.
So that's what he's trying to avoid, using that
Yeah.
modal logic basically there, or modal contingency
Yeah, he's
argument.
forced
So
into doing that. He's actually forced into doing that because that's the
he
only.
is forced to do that basically,
Yeah.
because
So it's not that
if you
it's
listen
not
to
a bad thing.
Khayali's if
If
you
that's the
listen to
case, I don't think
Khayali's
he modeled it. I don't think he modeled it through an accident. He has to because he has to avoid
Exactly.
the
maybe
necessary.
that's maybe maybe
He has to introduce some sort of brute contingency in there. So what I mean by brute contingency is that it could have been different, but for no reason at all, right? It's a contingent,
Then
which is something
then
that
it
they
wouldn't
could.
be God.
Yeah,
Then it wouldn't be God, right? So that's why.
yeah. One problem, exactly. One problem is that it doesn't sit harmoniously with God, and the other problem is that you avoided pushing back the problem, which is what I said yesterday. Because if P implies Q or something like that, if P is necessary, then Q must follow. By introducing free will into it, you've not avoided that, right? So originally the problem is the following, right? I exist, Milky Way exists, which caused me. I'm dependent upon that or something, and then the Milky Way is dependent on the Big Bang, and then that's dependent on not necessary God, right? But if God is necessary, then the Big Bang is necessary as well. Well, now all they've done is they've introduced free will in there, right? Now, all of those things, apart from God, everything that I've mentioned there, the Big Bang, the Milky Way, the me, we're all contingent, right? And now they've introduced another one in this set called free will, which is also contingent. So have they avoided the problems of P implies Q? No. How did they? They've just added another contingent thing, and that contingent thing needs to depend on something according to this logic. And if God is necessary, then it has to be the case that his free will is necessary as well. In which case, it's not free will. Linguistically, we have to change the wording, right? Because the implications are it's not free. So you still have necessary.
So you mean his decision, or
Yeah.
you think his decision must be necessary?
Yeah, I mean, because if the problem is such that if a necessary being exists, then all the contingent things don't exist anymore. They have to be necessary. Then God's free will is going to be another contingent thing, right? So how have they avoided the problem of modal collapse? Unless you think the point is it's a consistency problem. Unless you think, for example, brute contingencies can exist. If you accept brute contingencies can exist,
Yeah.
then it's no longer a
And
problem.
again, then it's not again. Then the point of his argument again it becomes pointless, right? Because what he's trying to prove is God, but once he agrees that brute contingencies can exist, then
Yeah.
okay, then we are fine with it. Then we are on square one.
Well, they could do some sort of like special plating, whereas only God can have a brute contingency.
Yeah, and that's what he did actually. I mean, in a way, because he said that God has more explanatory power, and that's what he power, right? That's what he used the term.
Yeah,
Explanatory
explanatory.
depth.
Yeah,
I don't know what that
explanatory
depth is though, because he said ended up saying that he is the way he is the way he is. Okay,
You
if
can
he's the way he is, yeah,
always come up with a solution which explains this world much better. Maybe a,
yeah,
panoply of gods, Greek gods probably explain it much better. There's a thunderbolt god, there's a demon for earthquakes and all those things. That is a much better explanation, right? You have many entities, with different characteristics. A good god cannot explain all these things, basically, right? I mean, either
right.
you get rid of that good god and all, omnibenevolent and all-knowing and all those characteristics. You can't keep all those things and still,
You know,
explain it with. He said Allah, basically, right? Not just
uh,
a god, basically, right?
right. You know what?
So
Something I also wanted to
anyway,
point out
howdy.
something.
Let's welcome
Yeah, howdy.
Howdy. How you
Uh,
doing?
howdy.
No, I'm good. I
Uh,
saw your thing, and it's going over one of the arguments that I think is at least somewhat interesting for theism. I don't know if he's running something like the modal ontological argument, like the necessity contingency sort of stuff, but
Yeah.
or
Basically, Islam is
have you
basically
been?
running his own
Sorry.
version. Yeah, sorry. Just want to point
Sorry,
that
just
out.
wanted to probe
Yeah.
a little bit. Where are you joining from? Can you introduce yourself a little bit, and then have you joined our stream before? I'm not quite sure.
no, this is you just popped up on my feed or whatever on YouTube.
All right. Can we know where you're calling from, and do you have a background in
I seem to.
philosophy?
I've seen you somewhere. Have you been on other streams?
Yeah, I show up on philosophy and theology streams sometimes.
What
Are
stream do
you a
you usually
theist
come
or?
on? Oh yeah, first question. That is the first question, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, are you a theist? Where you joining from? Are you joining from US?
Yeah, I'm from the United States and I am agnostic.
Okay. All right. All right. All right. All right. Please go ahead and whatever
Yeah.
you want to ask or contribute, just please go ahead.
Oh, I think I can just chime in here and there, maybe.
Sure.
Okay. Sure.
Do you
Sure.
have a background in philosophy, by the way?
A little bit, nothing formal, but I have a lot of free time and I've read a lot, I'll say.
All right. Great. Yeah. Maybe you can then contribute. Uh, yeah. What are your thoughts on what did you get a chance to listen to it? You didn't, right?
No, I think I saw like from about 5 or 10 minutes since now. So just he's starting to lay out the premises in the document or something.
Right, right. I think they're using one of the four. I don't know. I'm aware of only four contingency, four flavors rather of contingency argument. There might be others. I don't know. I don't think so. There are, but if there are, then please do let me know. And then they started off with, of course, the dependency contingency, and then they switched over to modal contingency, and then probably one of those guys, Faisal, who's writing it, basically started off going into causal contingency and all those things. So we just reviewing it. I think if you haven't seen our video for our live stream from yesterday, you also might want to check that out, basically, because we already did this, but then since we are a team of three, basically a team of four, fourth one is probably missing forever. And so Callie just joined, and so we are just reviewing
Oh,
it,
you're like
basically.
rotating people. Okay.
Yeah. So we have a, yeah, it's a small, it's an informal team rather than something formal, basically, right?
Yeah, well, I liked what you guys were saying. You seemed like somewhat reasonable and somewhat knowledgeable. So I was like, oh, these guys, I'm gonna hop on.
All right, great.
Yeah, you can
Callie, you wanted to
do
put
chime
some.
in. Yeah, do chime in wherever you think you can add something. Yeah, I wanted to point out something that, particularly the point about the set of contingent beings being necessary, and Faisal had, and Islam was open to that possibility, in because he was actually arguing for it, you know, on the basis of some, the set theory as well. The set of all things, should it include that set itself,
The
right? Set of
Russell's
all sets.
paradox.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Russell's
So,
paradox,
so I
basically. Yeah.
think something that I wanted to point out is, when you think about their concept of God, because they don't believe in divine simplicity, because that is a different kind of version where everything is God's essence, and all of God's attributes are identical to His essence and all of that, right? So because that's different, and what I'm going to say right now wouldn't apply to that concept, but the orthodox view of Islamic God, particularly, and I think many other gods as well, is not that of divine simplicity. Rather, the God has his set of attributes, and these attributes are distinct from each other. They are not identical to each other. So God's knowledge is not identical to His essence, and God's essence is not identical to His will, and it is not identical to His power, or potential, capacity. Or
Omnipotence,
now,
right? Yeah.
what do you think about when you think about this? What that means is that God is a set of all these things, and these things are codependent. And I've used this is not a word that I am using alone. I've heard Muslims using this word where they'd say that God's attributes are codependent. They have used that word. Now, the moment you say, and or pose a kind of God where his attributes are distinct from his other attributes, then you are actually believing in a kind of a God which is actually a set of contingent beings, because, or entities, because when you're saying is knowledge would depend for its existence on, let's say, the essence of God, right? What that means is knowledge becomes contingent in a way, correct?
Right. And but at that point, everything becomes muddled. That's why one of the
Exactly. No.
solution they have found.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
please go ahead.
The solution
Please
they
go ahead.
found. What's the solution?
No, they say that these attributes are not dependent but are co-eternal with God, basically, or
So
they have,
exactly,
yeah,
but the
yeah,
moment they say they are codependent, what that means is they are not independent, correct?
right,
They are not independent of each other. The moment you say that they are not independent, then they are codependent means they are dependent, right?
yeah, they are dependent, yeah,
Codependent is a type of dependency. Now, what that means is these things are not, these attributes themselves are not independent or necessary, you would say, but the whole set of these attributes you claim, or they claim, that set is necessary and
isn't
independent. So this is the exact kind of thing that Faisal was having an issue with.
issue with, right. Right.
but they believe in that kind of God because they don't believe in divine simplicity. So if you believe in that kind of God, which is the majority of Muslims and majority of, I think, of theists as well, because majority of the people who believe in God, they don't believe in divine simplicity, which
Right.
means
Right.
that they already believe in this kind of a set of contingent beings being necessary. So
Right.
but they never think about it in that way because somehow they actually employ special. They don't even realize, but they're actually employing special pleading for this.
Pleading. Right. Right. Right.
That's generally how a lot of theistic arguments play out. They accuse non-theists of having a problem that they can solve, and their quote-unquote solution is to invent this God entity, and all this problems you stuff it in there, and then just because
Yeah,
it's encapsulated by this idea, therefore it's all totally okay. I mean, there's only three possible, ways it can go if you're either doing like a causal or an explanatory chain, because some people run like either causal or PSR type. But in any case, there's this chain, right? It's either going to stop when you're a foundationalist, or it's going to go infinite regress, or it's going to be circular. At some point, it's going to go like C, B, A, but then A is dependent on C, and then C, and then you're in a circle at the bottom, which is I think what these guys would do. Because I actually talked to that guy, and this is one of the questions I ask him is, is he identical to his attributes? And they say no, and then like you said, well, they're codependent. Okay, then we just got a circle at the bottom. And
exactly.
the problem that it tries to solve, it doesn't solve because there has to be, you can't have a set of contingent things. And then, okay, then what? Okay, well, we have this God, and then he's a set of contingent things. So it's unclear what sort of explanatory power the theory would hold.
So did he give any response to that?
No, because I'm pretty laid back. I'm not really trying to argue generally. I
Oh
just
yeah,
try to get what their thoughts are. I wasn't gonna like grill them on it. I was just
yeah,
wondering
yeah.
like what they thought about.
You're kind of like me
I
then. I
think
don't
that's the
grill
best
people as well.
approach. That's the best approach,
Yeah,
basically. I mean, at least you have to sometimes just point a little bit to their problems, basically, and their arguments. But then I think that's the best approach. Just relax, chill out, have a discussion. If they don't agree, perfectly fine. If they agree, if you can, reach to a consensus, that's perfectly fine as well. Very much, right? And I think I have I had a discussion with Islam Hakim? I don't know. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, I don't think so. But anyways, shall we run this video forward?
Yeah, let's watch the rest of the video so we can see what they
Yeah,
actually say. Yeah.
let's go.
Shall we backtrack? Martin, this is the point you said we stopped last time?
Yeah, roughly around that area. So it doesn't
Shall I
really
back it
matter.
up a little bit?
No, yeah, you can. It doesn't really matter as long as those three statements at the bottom are there. Because that's when we kind
Okay.
of like.
All right. Let's go for it.
I can't see it.
Yes.
Yeah. Philo, we don't have it on screen.
Yeah, I don't have it on the screen, basically. Yes. Thanks for pointing that out. I do that quite often. I'm very good at doing that, basically.
Okay, and let me share screens. And then we can try and build this argument from the ground up. Okay, premise. Oh, wait. Premise one.
Philo, you're starting from the beginning.
Yeah.
We start with
We can see if we can fit it in a syllogism, but I don't usually think of in which case you're heading toward.
getting that part, and maybe you would be able to expand on this.
Yeah.
Madan, is this the part we stopped? I forgot.
Yes,
Maybe
yes.
we need to check.
It's just before the three solutions come along, we can start there.
Okay. Here, right?
You would say, but this is interesting.
So for me, if it really depends on the person what they do with contingency. With the other ones, I would start talking about, well, why would you prefer pantheism? Do you even recognize it as pantheism? So this came up with discussion with naturalists, and he very easily or quickly said, you know what, okay, if you want to call it pantheism, I'm happy to go down that route. Whereas for some people, there's a violent aversion to framing it that way, and then you would discuss why there's violent aversion to that, right?
So asking the question,
this comes back to the question then, okay, what is a natural law? What is, what are these laws of nature? Who's the giver of these laws? And if that's not a good question because you think it's begging the question by saying who, then, how did these laws came to be? And you can't just use another regress of just putting terms on things,
Yeah, but I want to dive a bit into this, the container set theory, where you're saying that this set of contingent things is now necessary existence.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to clarify that, and I mentioned it yesterday. He seems to be defining any form of naturalism then as pantheism, but then they're not the same thing necessarily. So I think people need to be aware of the fact that these words can be used differently, and this is why some atheists may object to the term. No, don't frame me as a pantheist, right? Because pantheism has a different, and I mentioned it yesterday, has a different sort of flavor to it, right? It's more of a psychological sort of outlook on the universe. There's different versions of it. I readily admit that, and I've not read all of them. But that should give Hakim enough awareness to think, why should I impose pantheism on everybody, right? Just because you're a naturalist who believes, let's say, there are natural laws, and that's it. That doesn't mean you're a pantheist, right? Pantheism has a very specific sort of almost religious-like reverence, devotion, loyalty, psychological outlook on the universe that you view the universe almost godlike, maybe figuratively, right? And you don't need to have that sort of psychological orientation to the universe if you're a naturalist. You can be a naturalist.
Yeah, God is omnipervasive, pretty much, right?
Or something like that. I mean, it's the idea that I think somebody said that. I don't know who it was. They sex up the universe, looking at the universe in a sexy way, right? Maybe it was Hamza Tzortzis. I can't remember who said that. But yeah, you don't need to look at it like that. You can be a naturalist and have a completely different, never even think about it in a pantheistic sense, right? Where you think of it in like one of the closest who comes to that is people like Einstein, people like Neil Tyson deGrasse, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I mean, they look at it in an almost pantheistic sense. The universe is us, is one, and they look at it with wonder and awe. But I'm not sure any sort of wonder and awe constitutes pantheism. If you look at the definition of pantheism, it's slightly different than that. You almost look at it in godlike way, right? And it's in this kind of wiggle room, and it's like a very psychological kind of place to be. And not every atheist who's a naturalist.
Yeah, I think its definition is so loose that I'll give it to him that whatever he's saying, right? Because it's so loose. Basically, what is it? Where does it come from? It's Spinoza's concept.
Yeah.
It is basically, right? And so yeah, I think it's pretty loose that even Einstein or people like what's his name, that physicist. I mean, a lot of these Niels Bohr, Schrodinger, and all these physicists were probably, they called themselves pantheists, pretty much, right? So
yeah. And just before you proceed, and the other thing is that pantheism has nothing to do with necessariness or contingency or whatever, right? Not necessarily anyway, right? So let's say
I totally, I mean,
let's say you look at the universe in a Spinozian sense, but also think it's contingent, right? Are you a pantheist only if you think it's necessary? Where did this come from? See,
I think he's there's no talk of necessary or group contingency or all these things.
Yeah.
There.
So he just uniquely specifies pantheism to the second solution.
Totally. I mean, he's misattributing it to.
The container set is necessary, therefore pantheism. But he could have equally applied the word pantheism to the first solution, the group contingency. Right? Like, because all pantheists think is that the universe has this kind of sexy thing, right? Which can be brutally contingent. I mean, what's the issue with that? And even the third one, right? Necessary existence. So the third solution almost implies theistic language, right? And it's not really a third solution, because if there's a necessary existence external to, he puts creation, but it could just be necessary existence external to its contingent effects or whatever you want to call it, right? And that was consistent with atheism. You can be an atheist who thinks there is a necessary existence of the universe, right? It's not brutally contingent. The entire container set is not necessary. It's just that there are contingent things, and there is a necessary thing that it's built on, and that can also be consistent with pantheism. It depends. So this is why I don't like this framing of how they've kind of described it.
Right. So I think I mean, I would ask Islam, then who do you think is I mean, how do you define an atheist? Who would you consider an atheist now? Then, right?
Yeah, he has excluded almost everything pretty much out of.
I think what he would consider an atheist. I think he would consider someone an atheist if they believe in infinite regress. I guess so, because that is the only other possibility that they have left. Only remaining option. I guess that's what they.
I would take that back. Not only remaining option, but one of the most promising. Promising remaining option. One of the most prominent, rather than promising, basically. One of the most prominent remaining option, basically. I mean, there might be other options as well, which we haven't considered probably. So yeah, you're right. I think that's the only one he's giving us, and they have at every cost tried to avoid that infinite regress thing, basically. And for what reason? I don't think they have given a single reason, basically. I mean, Faisal has even gone on to saying that it just doesn't make sense, or it's intuition or whatever, right? And then intuition is not your logic, basically. It's not going to pass through what I think Arish Ahmed said once, right? I mean, it may pass through a Talbot theological school or whatever, but it won't pass in Cambridge, basically. Something of that sort, right? In one of the debates with William Lane Craig, right? Anyway.
I think what we could say that the very basis of this contingency argument, or not only this, I think the contingency argument relies on the basic point of it is that infinite regress is not possible. I think I might be missing something, but if you look at it, I think that is the very basic point that it is arguing against.
I think the dependency contingency argument probably tell that.
No, but, even temporal and causal,
even temporal, even causal.
Except
I think if you look at all of them,
except for modal, all three.
Yeah,
out of
exactly.
So
three of them rely on infinite regress is not possible. Yeah.
The contingency argument uniquely tries to argue that it gets around kalam, in the sense that if you do think that an infinite regress can exist, then kalam is the kalam cosmological argument. You can't get to the conclusion that there has to be a beginning. You've avoided that, right? So everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and then you eventually build up with other arguments to get to God. But if you think that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and then you think the universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause, and you really want to terminate this regress of causes in order to start with the beginning, and that is a God or something. You can get around the kalam by making a strong case for infinite regress being like metaphysically possible. There's nothing wrong with infinities. There's no logical contradiction to think there's an infinite. You can have infinite sets existing, or create an infinite set from the past to the present to the future, and you can, through successive addition, come to today. All these problems have been, let's say, circumvented. The contingency argument, at least I think the model one, uniquely wants to make the argument. Uniquely has a strength there in the sense that it says even if there's a infinite regress of things, because they will be contingent, then you have to explain that. Yes. That is the unique power of the contingency argument. I think it's the modal one.
The only modal one, because in this one as well, in the dependency contingency as well, they at one point probably implicitly so assume that you can't have infinite chain of dependency, that's why unnecessary, basically, right? I think they just swallowed that logic, basically, right? But it's more prominent in the kalam, basically, right? Because
what I want to say here, what I'm saying here is that the modal contingency argument advocate can happily embrace an infinite regress and still so you just need to challenge an infinite. That's what I'm trying to say. So, because like Kylie said, that I think they all depend upon defeating an infinite regress. I think the modal version of it doesn't. They can embrace
I agree.
infinite regress.
Yeah,
That's what
you're
I
right.
mean.
The rest of the three, I think they clearly rely on this concept of impossibility of infinite regress, but the modal one doesn't. I agree.
I think there is. I'm not quite sure. Modal seems to have a problem with infinite regress as well. Let me see. I'm thinking. I thought something
The
like
modal
this,
one
but
just
that
means
doesn't.
the
See,
modal one just means that if
here's the
something is a
problem.
specific way
Right.
and it is
Can you
possible for
have?
it to be any other way, then
Yeah,
it
yeah.
must
I think
there must be a sufficient reason for it to be that way.
that's right. Yeah.
So yeah.
I think people who make modal contingency arguments, they do simultaneously also as a first line of defense try to attack an infinite regress, but then they embrace it and go, even if you accept an infinite regress, principle of sufficient reason cuts through it. You still have to explain how the set of infinite things where it came from. You still need to explain that by something necessary. So that's what they try to do. But what I'm trying to say is it's not a crucial premise to defeat. You don't have to disprove an infinite regress. You can take that part out entirely and happily accept it and still make the contingency argument go through.
Yeah, but I think you are both right, and the reason for that is in modal contingency argument, there is no concept of a chain of events, basically, right? I mean, there is no concept of that kind of a chain that you're talking about, either causal or temporal or even dependency, right? It is only a possibility. It's either possible or it's necessary, right? And so that's why it seems to circumvent that problem of infinite regress, right?
I think it still has an infinite regress problem that they have to address. Like, okay, so the problem is, it's just because what they'll say, their interlocutor say, well, I just take it that the universe is eternal, and then I have my infinite regress, and then they collect it as a set, and they say, well, what explains the total set of all these contingent things? But they still have a problem because you could say, okay, it's by this necessary thing, and then why can't there be an infinite chain of necessary beings? You see what I mean? Like, you're getting this co-creator chain that they're going to have to deal with at some point. So that's why then they have to go to some ontology. That's why it's like two phases. That's why they also need. So granted that this argument works, which needs to be shown, but granted that it works, they also have to cut their creator chain down to one. So that's why they need also the ontological or some other stage 2 argument to get it to traditional theism.
I think, but still, how do you, I mean, maybe if you can elaborate it a bit more. I think the modal contingency argument, which is that if something is a specific way, then you need a sufficient reason for it to be that way. What would be the problem in that way? How could you
No,
bring in
I think
it's
we
like,
need to
what's
we need to
this?
have the
problem?
proper definition of in the modal framework, basically, right?
Sorry?
We need to have a proper
Yeah.
definition of contingency and necessary, basically, in the modal framework, and that is which contingent is if it fails to exist in at least one possible world, and that's the definition of contingency, right? And necessary is if it fails to exist in even single world, then it necessarily doesn't exist, right? Or it has to exist in all the possible worlds, basically, right? That's the definition, right? And with that definition, I don't see where the infinite it doesn't have to rely on infinite regress, basically. That's the point I was trying to make, right? So whether the universe is eternal or not, howdy, I'm not quite sure I got your point, but basically, even if it's eternal, maybe it circumvents that problem that is there in the other contingency problems, right? The infinite regress problems, right? Because the universe, even if it's eternal, it could have just failed to exist. So it's one of the possible worlds, basically.
Or just exist differently. Like the eternal universe could be a different type of eternal universe.
Yeah, a different type of eternal, basically. Yes, exactly.
No, I'm saying granted that they still have to cut down the creator chain. So let's say, okay, well, there's this necessary being that explains the infinite causal chain or whatever. Then what explains the necessary being? Oh, it could be another necessary being that explains this necessary being, and there could be a third necessary being, and then you have a chain of infinite necessary beings that explains the one necessary creator being of this universe.
Madan, I'm not getting you, by the way, over there.
Who?
So
Me? I didn't say
it's
anything.
no. I'm trying to understand where does the creator, infinite regress in the creator comes from?
So they're subscribing to some form of PSR. So you have this necessary being. Okay, what's the sufficient reason that explains this necessary being? And it could be the case that it's another necessary being that explains
No,
this necessary
it's
being.
it's not a causal chain to another. The necessary being is the necessary being. Basically, that's all the claim of the modal contingency is. Basically, right? There's no chain to be talked about. Basically, or no cause. No explanation to be talked about. Right? Either a necessary being that exists in all possible, a being that exists in all possible world exists. That means it's necessary, basically, right? It can't fail to exist even in a single one, right? If it does, then it's a contingent being existence,
Yeah,
basically,
that's
right?
right.
So,
If you terminate
yeah,
on a necessary being, then it doesn't need an explanation outside of itself.
yeah, it doesn't need an explanation outside
Yeah.
that. So
That's what they
that's
say.
why
I'm
I'm
not saying
saying.
this is
Then,
right. I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying for the consistency's sake, if
yeah,
it's true that there is a necessary being, then by definition it can't fail to exist in all possible worlds because it necessarily must exist in all worlds. So that how they define contingency is that it can fail to exist, logically
yeah.
possible,
So,
not physically.
given that
Not
framework of definition, they get to what the necessary being is. Then it doesn't need any explanation because it's been explained by the definitions of that moral logic, basically, right?
yeah. So it can. So it's not the case that it's physically possible for it to fail to exist. It's logically possible. I can.
Right.
It's just armchair thinking. I can imagine, for example, I can imagine a rock not existing. I can imagine a tree not existing and it being something else. That's how they kind of go with contingency, define contingency. I can conceive of it in one possible world to be different. Whereas I can't conceive of 2 plus 2 equaling to 4 being different in another possible world. 2 plus 2 will equal 4 in all possible worlds. Therefore, 2 plus 2 is necessary. That's kind of the standard 2 plus 2. I think Howdy left. That's the
I'm here.
Oh, has it? Sorry. It's the Salman Khan fan. He's kind of just camouflaged. Howdy. You can see it.
Oh.
There we go. 2 plus 2. I thought you may have got fed up with us.
It seems as though what your guys are saying is that all necessary beings must be brute, which I don't see any motivations for believing. Like, so let's say your example, 2 plus 2 equals 4. For that to just be some bruteness, then you're saying that there's no explanation to be rendered as to why it obtains, which is
No, but
incredibly implausible to me.
Howdy, the problem we are having here is, and that's the same thing that I took up with these guys as well, Islam. They are jumping from one argument to the other. If you are sticking to just the modal contingency argument, then you have to stay within that framework. Now, when you talk about PSR or maybe explanation-based contingency argument, right? This explains that, that explains that. Then you're jumping onto a different category of contingency argument. So
Okay, yeah, I was mainly addressing
once you are working on this framework of modal contingency argument, then within that framework, once they have defined it necessary as a being that exists, that cannot fail to exist, and even a single possible universe, then the necessary being has been established. Basically, that's the definition of it. Basically,
right. I'm sorry if I was maybe confusing. I was just saying that they have an infinite regress to deal with in stage 2, which is why I say that they need some modal explanation.
Stage 2 is later on, right? Stage 2, we even don't want to deal with stage 2 at this point, at least.
Sorry.
Stage 2 is another beast, pretty much, right? I mean, even if all of us granted them stage 1, I think stage 2 is more problematic for them. Basically, a lot of atheists have no problem in accepting stage 1. Basically, even Graham Oppie, I think, thinks that stage 1. He would concede it that it probably goes through. Maybe even he is more inclined towards believing in there being one necessary existence, probably, whatever it may be, right? But you don't know what its attributes are, pretty much, right? So
Yeah.
Well, Oppie will
What
say it
makes
doesn't matter. He
what
says
makes
either
that
way it doesn't
necessary?
matter because it lacks theoretical virtues, and you just reject theism on theoretical virtuous grounds, generally.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Yeah, so you could be in happy acceptance with the contingency argument, but make an argument for the necessity of the universe. So there's no reason why a contingency argument should get you to the conclusion of theism. You could get to the conclusion of
Yeah.
atheism. Well,
Yeah,
in fact, with
That was,
with Oppie's
if
theoretical virtues and explanatory power. So this is the argument then at the stage of arguing that what has better explanatory power, right? Better explanatory power, and Oppie would say it's a simpler explanation to just suggest that the universe is necessary. Yeah, that'll be the explanation. Yeah.
It's like an open question whether it's contingent or necessary, or brutally contingent or brutally necessary. But he says in all the four cases, theism doesn't better explain anything, so it doesn't really matter. I'll just say this and then shut up for a while. I will say that saying brute contingency is giving up on reasoning is probably a bit too sharp. I don't think it's like it's incumbent on any like rational actors to accept whatever version of PSR is employed. Not necessarily.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, he didn't explain. Maybe he's going to go and explain it, but he doesn't really explain why it's a brutally contingent thing is giving up on reasoning. But brute contingency is giving up on reasoning. What does he even mean by that? He thinks if something is just the way it is, even though it can be possibly different in one possible world. Again, we have to sneak in the assumptions of modality in a dependency context, right? Because that's how it only makes sense. If something is brutally contingent, and in the dependency contingency argument, what does that mean? It just means that there isn't anything necessary. It's just dependent. If something is dependent, so can you see what I'm saying? If it's purely a dependency contingency argument, what does being brutally contingent mean in that context? I would like to know. What do you think they mean? I'm actually asking
yeah,
you guys.
I'll just stop you for a moment and ask the Salman Khan fan to jump in and have a conversation.
Because here in the dependency context, all brute contingency means is it's a dependent thing, right? Does he mean that it just depends on something without anything being necessary, right?
I think
I'm not
he's
sure what it
taking
means.
he's saying like he's saying like, okay, let's say someone thinks everything's contingent, and he's asking what explains the set of, so he's invoking some sort of PSR. He's saying what explains the set of contingents, and then you say, well, it's just the whole set is contingent, and then that's giving up on reasoning for some reason that I don't see. Maybe.
Yeah, I would like to. Here it's just a problem of its lack of elaboration. I would like to know what a brute contingency is in his mind. I'm not sure what he means. Right? It makes sense. It makes sense in a modal context, but it doesn't make sense in this context.
I guess he would say something like the whatever universe he's attempting to describe with this set. Assumably it's a fact that obtains. So like it being brute would say that it's like it's inexplicable. There's no reason to be rendered as to why this set exists.
Okay. I mean, if it's something like that,
I think you have to smuggle some form or the other of PSR in these arguments anyways, basically, right?
Yeah.
And so I think they are invoking PSR on this, and then they are saying that brute contingencies is a problem, basically. But then he's not saying brute contingencies are a problem, but he's saying brute contingencies have less explanatory power than Allah, right? So that's what they are saying. At least Islam is saying.
If we accept, let's say the universe arises from a quantum fluctuation, and that's it. But why does it arise out of a quantum fluctuation? There's no reason for that.
Yeah, I
Right?
mean, there could be many reasons where you don't have explanations for them. I mean, one of the very common that we cite usually is that, yeah, I mean, quantum fluctuation, right? You know, quarks and, you know, these fundamental particles popping in and out of existence. And someone might, you know, just question that, hey, you don't know the reasons as of now, but there probably are reasons for it, you know. The same is true for the radioactive decay, right? You
Yeah.
know that half-life of something, maybe let's carbon-14 is whatever, you know, 6,000 years or so, but when it's gonna decay at a particular, you know, a particle is not known and the cause is not known, basically, right? So there's no explanation for it, basically, right? Maybe there is an explanation for decay, I don't know.
Yeah.
But
Well, one of the interpretations is that there is no explanation for it. There's no cause behind it. I'm not trying to simultaneously use cause and explanation as the same thing. But in this
yeah, cause
context,
and explanation has to be they have to be
yeah.
kept apart,
But in this
basically.
context, it's hard to see it. What else do you mean by other than a causal one? You want to know why the decay happens at this particular level or whatever, and maybe there isn't any reason. But why is it giving up on reasoning? You're not giving up on reasoning because you're using your reasoning to arrive at the conclusion that there is some things.
There's no reason, basically, yeah.
Right? Because of through investigation, maybe scientific investigation, maybe we mapped out everything and we can definitively conclude that there actually has no reason behind it. There's no further cause behind it. It just happens, and that might be a scientific discovery.
That's
it's
a
not
possibility, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
so
that's why I have a problem with PSR, strong PSR, basically.
yeah,
I don't know whether weak
my point
PSR
is,
works in these cases or not, but you know, yeah.
yeah, my point is, as an interested scientific mindful person, you're not giving up on reasoning. You're actually using your scientific tools of investigation to determine and come to the conclusion that this actually doesn't have a cause. So you've not given up on reasoning or something like that, whatever that means, right? But it's using scientific reasoning as a method to come to the conclusion that this doesn't have a cause any further than this, right? And that's in this context a brutally contingent thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's some arguments for PSR. Sorry if I'm a little loud. You would say something like, well, in any investigative science or introspection, you're at least assuming the possibility of an explanation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be investigating. Like, you wouldn't even experiment. You would just say, oh, it's just this inexplicable brute fact that obtains, and that's the end of it. So insofar as people still try to find an explanation, it implicitly assumes the possibility of one, and that's one route. I mean, there's several arguments for PSR, but as far as like what is it called? Like the small scales, right, where things seem like brutally contingent, where you say, well, why is it that this particular particle decayed at this particular time? And it's like, we don't have an explanation, sorry. And what's stronger, I think, is you could say, well, in some cases, there's not even an explanation that could be rendered in principle. So Bell's inequality, I think, hacked apart the hidden variables theory. So you're either going to have to, you're committed to rejecting very, very, and I would at least say intuitive notions like locality and stuff. Like, you have to make extremely huge sacrifices if you want to posit that why the data for the Bell's inequality obtains if you're going to hold the PSR. That might be a little technical. I don't know if I'm articulating that clearly, though.
I think I do understand that, and maybe I don't 100% agree with that. I think both the explanations probably should be equal. When you say something like, you know, you can't explain something, and then on principle there is no reason, that still needs an explanation why you're saying that, basically, right? Maybe I'm not able to explain it properly. So when you said that, you know, when we said that some of the particles can pop in and out of existence without a cause or without a reason, maybe, I don't know, we should keep those apart. But then if you think that if you said that by principle we can't have a reason for something, some of the causes or some of the events, basically, I think that's the same thing pretty much. You'll have to explain why can't you have explanations. Basically, it's you have resorted to an axiom in my estimation, I think.
Well,
But
without rejecting locality, are you familiar with the experiment in Bell's inequality that says that if there were a hidden variable, it would produce like a particular set of data? But
no, I'm not familiar with that.
Just to, and I'm not very well versed in it, but when I read about it, I think it did exclude the possibility of hidden local variables.
that's what I'm
But
saying. You have to. If you're going to hold the PSR, you're committed to non-locality, which is a pretty
okay.
huge bullet to
Okay.
bite.
Okay.
Which you can do. I mean, you can say that there's. Well, one thing a PSR person could always say is, well, what's the explanation as to why it's not like what's the reason for not PSR? And so it's like, I don't know. What do you want from me?
Yeah, going deep down the. So, shall we move on with the video? I think we have gone on to a very deep,
Yeah.
not maybe tangent, but something they have completely missed. See, they in their whole discussion they never touched upon the PSR part, right? And yesterday as well, Madin and I were talking about it, and I said the very hidden assumption there is they are adhering to that strong PSR here, right?
I think it's there. I mean, they never actually bring up PSR. If you think about it, whenever I've seen them bringing up the contingency argument, I've never actually seen them actually, or maybe
Talk
I might
about
have missed it.
PSR, yeah,
Talk about
yeah,
in fact, I remember that someone was discussing, a Christian was discussing the contingency argument with Mohammed Hijab, and the Christian actually mentioned that okay, so you are the contingency argument uses PSR, right? It needs PSR. So, but
and
Hijab
Christian
was sort
said
of
to
resisting it,
Hijab,
and yeah, the Christian said to Hijab, and Hijab seemed to be resisting it. No, it isn't necessary for me to consider PSR. And the Christian guy was actually explaining, no, I mean, you are actually, you need that for your argument. Basically, it's a sort of an hidden assumption. But he said, and he was trying to prove that no, it actually, I don't need the PSR. And I don't know how, I mean, he
yeah,
didn't
Well, if
actually
I
you
prove
think
it, but
if you don't need the PSR, I'll just say that the fact that
yeah,
reality obtains is just a brute fact, and
yeah.
yeah,
it requires no
yeah, that's
explanation.
right.
Somehow he was trying to explain it without using PSR. And the Christian was continuously telling him that it's how you are actually going to do it. So, but that seems to be a habit in Muslims. They at least among Muslims, I've never seen them. Maybe they do, but most of the time I've not heard them mentioning PSR.
Right, right. All right, let's move on. Let's listen a little bit more of it.
Stuff.
Yeah.
Very
Can we
much
just, while we're
pantheism.
discussing it, we just put an exclamation mark next to premise 5 so that people don't think we're stating it as a.
Oh, okay. That one.
Yeah.
Where's my exclamation mark? Here it is. Okay.
There we go.
So premise 5. Let's see. Now let's go to this one. We're diving into this. All right. So for me, one of the possible problems of someone who is positing this type of theory is that the set of contingent things cannot be a necessary existence because it actually takes away causal existence, if I'm using the term right. What I basically mean is if we're talking about existence, one thing causing the other to come into existence, right? Then this idea that it started with something must be there, because we cannot have it linked, coming back and linking to something at the end of the chain when it doesn't exist, when that thing doesn't exist at the beginning of the chain.
Right. Well, whichever way you cut it, it ends up being at least one exception to the rule of causal closure, and that's the rub. That's what it boils down to. Is hang on a minute. If naturalism means everything has to have a causal closure, and yet you're saying the container set is necessary, you're violating causal closure in this neat exception.
Yeah.
Hang on.
That one thing.
Do this. What do you think of that? Is that your thinking as well?
Sorry, I didn't follow the exact last one.
Okay, no worries. I
So-
just want to exclude you from the conversation. That was all.
Yeah, sorry.
I think, can you pause it?
Because the thing that I'm thinking.
I think what I mentioned earlier, and I think Howdy also mentioned that he, sorry, he discussed this with Islam as well about, the kind of objection that they're raising would apply to their concept of God as well. Sorry.
Yeah, and I don't even think that the infinite regress guy even has to accept that it's rejecting causal closure to say that taking the set of these things even is incumbent to be given an explanation. They could be like a theorist, or I forget which one A or B is with the presentists. They'll say, well, this
Atheist,
is
basically.
yeah.
Presentists are atheist, yeah.
Yeah, they'll just say, well, there is no such set. Sorry. They'll just say it, and then it's just there's this chain, and you can't collect it because, I mean, the past doesn't even exist. Neither does the future. It's just this series. So you can't even collect this as. But after that, they'll say, well, to close it, you're going to either, like, I could go in a circle. Why couldn't I go in a circle? And then I don't know why they were upset with that. They just say, oh, you can't do that. But it's unclear to me why it couldn't be like a circular chain.
If you look at it from the theistic perspective, those who believe in God and they attribute these qualities of timelessness to God. If you look at it, and I've mentioned this point in an earlier stream as well. From from their perspective, from the theistic perspective, God's perspective is the absolute perspective. It's the ultimate reality, and that reality is timeless, which means all the theists should be presentist or atheists, correct? Because in that case, all the past, present, and future actually exists together from God's
No,
perspective.
that would be B theorist, basically,
Sorry,
then.
B theorist.
Because
Sorry, B
present, yeah.
theorist. Sorry,
So
I
B
get
B
theorist.
theorist.
confused on that too.
B
I
theorist.
don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if from God's perspective, which is from their view the absolute perspective, so they from them everything is not relative. This Einstein view of general or everything is relative. No, from their view, God's view being the ultimate reality and the necessary existence and timeless existence, that should be the absolute view or the absolute perspective. In which case, the absolute perspective is timeless, where the past, present, and future doesn't exist. So everything that seems to be happening in this chain of events, one after the other, from God's perspective, that is not how it's happening. It's
Yeah,
all sort of happened. So from their
No,
view,
it's on.
they
Yeah,
should be
it's all a
theorists.
frame, basically. It's
Exactly.
it's
it's all an
it's
illusion. In fact, in
yeah,
fact, these concepts don't even make sense. I think. Like, what does it mean
yeah,
to God for something to be in a causal chain? Like, these God's
yeah.
gonna say,
Yeah.
like, what are you
Causal.
talking about?
I think then
Yeah.
William Lane Craig's simultaneous causation is the answer to that, basically. But then it's still there are problems remaining, basically. I
Yeah.
mean, you can talk about simultaneous causation for creation of the universe, but what about all the other events, basically? What about after this universe is over? Would there be time? What's going to happen in heaven and hell? Then again, you have that the concept of eternality, and then the same questions would arise to
Yeah.
uh, you know what are actions, basically, in heaven, basically. Actions do take place in time, are the states of changes within time, basically, or change in state, basically, right? And
Yeah.
change in state is defined as time. And when there is no time, basically, because I would assume when heaven or hell do exist, basically there won't be any time. I don't know. Maybe there are different theories within theological theories within Islam and Christianity on those. But I'm not aware of any of those. I don't know if
You see,
it's been talked about that
the,
much.
the concept, the saying that time was created is a paradoxical statement. It's a self-contradictory statement.
Yeah,
That
totally. I
time
mean,
was
because your
created ex
definition of
nihilo.
creation has to be
Yeah.
different over there than the one that is understood, basically. Yeah.
Usually, what happens is they say, "Oh, there's God causal, God time, God." They just
Yeah.
said
Yeah, I think
there's this new.
that's a better way of
Yeah.
explaining
But
God.
that they cannot explain it because they have no
But then it's
way to
a
explain it,
senseless
Yeah.
or they
premise.
just
Then
say
Eh,
it. Yeah.
what's crazy is they appeal to like this principle of sufficient reason, and then
Yeah.
any reason is in God, and then you ask them, well, why did
Yeah.
God X, or why does God Y, and they say, oh, we don't know, it's God. So
It's God.
you
Yeah.
offer nothing explanatory because you just say it's God, and then I say, okay, well, like why does he X? And that, I don't know, like how does God view this? I don't know. We can't. It's God. We can't. Like they take any problem they can find, they wrap it up and then throw it in like the trash compactor of this God entity.
Yeah.
It's really
And I mean, even when I was having a discussion with Islam and Faisal, I don't recall the exact point that they brought up, and I said, but even God would have this problem. But they said, no, we're not discussing God right now. Like, but if you bring up a point, if you're bringing up a sort of a contradiction, seeming contradiction, or a logical problem in my argument, then if that same problem applies to your God, then I'm going to bring it up, because I'm going to show you at least that either you have to be consistent, that or you have to prove that no, it does not apply to God. You cannot just set it aside, that no, we're not discussing about God right now. So
They have to all the time. They have to resort to special
yeah,
pleadings, basically,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
They don't
Almost
realize it. They
everything.
do it.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah,
almost in every problem that they bring up in the naturalistic view or the non-theistic worldview, all of that. I mean, I have not found a single issue which applies exclusively to just a theistic worldview. Maybe I cannot recall it right now. Oh, no,
right,
a non-theistic worldview, which doesn't
right.
actually apply to their worldview as well.
There will be right, totally. All right, Madin, you want to add something, or shall we move on? Or
No, no,
if you,
let's just
uh,
move on. Okay,
That's
okay,
fine.
let's
I
move on.
want them. I just want to see a little bit more meat from them so that we can address it. That's all.
Okay,
Mm.
okay.
Thinking of here, no matter how you look at it. Oh, Nate's here. And Nate, I'm bringing you up, but let me just finish this thought, right? So the reason why I feel this is not a good argument is because you're forcing something in the set which has a property different from the rest of the items in the set. So
but it's not
has
in the
to be-
set, you see, because you're saying that remember what I said about Russell's paradox? Does the set of all
Yeah.
sets contain itself? So if the set were contingent, then it would be inside the set that it contains. And so they would say, no, the set is necessary. It can't be contingent because the set contains everything that's contingent.
Yeah, but then for me, the problem again is that, okay, even if I grant you that the set is, this set itself is different from the set of what it contains, essentially. It has different properties. Or
The set has to be considered separate from the stuff it contains, yeah.
Yes. So then the question is, how can it have a property of necessity? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Because
this is the thing, and once you get it, you'll realize.
Let me just finish this up, because I'm not getting that part, and maybe you would be able to expand on this.
Yeah.
This set of contingent existences, if it becomes necessary, then how can it contain anything that is contingent within it? How can anything that is contingent be part of what we've now defined as a set of contingent things?
Right, so those two things get solved together, because remember what I said about this set that contains the contingent things. So it's not contingent itself. If it was, then it would be contained in itself. And since it's not contingent, you say it's necessary. But this is why also it's got to be, it's a exception to the concept of causal closure, because you can't say that the thing bounding stuff caused the contingent stuff inside, because if it's necessary, then it causes everything else by necessity, and now it's necessary and it's not contingent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
it's if you take the two together, particularly it being absent of participation in the causal network, that's the only way you resolve it. You have to give up. You have to take causal closure but one at least.
Yeah, but I feel that we're missing something when that argument is presented, because it does not confirm to what we know of existence stuff. Because if that was the case, then we're basically saying the cosmos, which includes the universe and whatever is beyond this universe, as a whole is a necessary existence. But the cosmos includes something which keeps changing, right? Means that it includes something which is contingent existence. Then how can it exclude the property of contingency?
Right, okay, so this is why you have to differentiate between the sort of boundary or container, or that which is encompassing everything, from the contents within. So it's like the difference between a sphere, which is the surface of a ball, and the whole ball, including everything inside it.
Okay, let's table that. Let me also think about it. It's an interesting
All right. I think last night as well I pointed this problem out with Faisal. I think he can't just understand. Maybe I'm being too harsh on him, basically, right? He just can't understand that when you're dealing with contingency argument, you have framed a deductive framework for argument, basically, right? Whatever 6 points he put in a syllogistic form. Now you can't appeal to your intuition of existences and insert it in an argument and ask why it fails based on that intuition. This is not how it's gonna work. Basically, I think at least at this point, I think Islam is right. I mean, he's when he's talking about those set of contingent beings as being necessary. I think he's perfectly right to do that, and that's what exactly I think. Khali, you pointed that problem out as well. I mean, there's the same problem with the attributes of Allah. Basically, you face that.
Yeah.
Islam doesn't realize that problem probably, but he at least agrees to that. That's a logical inference probably for
Yeah.
that set of contingent beings
At least
being necessary.
at least he agrees that this is
Yeah,
logically invalid.
yeah.
It just the only problem with that is that it doesn't have explanatory depth. That's
Yeah, that's
what
the
the term
only
that
thing
he has
he
used,
refers with that. Yeah,
which he hasn't demonstrated actually.
yeah.
He
I
just
mean,
said that God is the way he is.
yeah,
I don't know
yeah.
how is that more explanatory, deep.
Yeah, that's what I said. I mean, you can have a set of contingent things, and then each contingent thing could have more explanatory power. Basically, a set of unnecessary set of contingent things. Basically, but each contingent thing on its own has more explanatory power for that. Maybe he's talking about that, just the set explaining itself. Maybe probably he's right. Maybe I don't know. I haven't weighed it up. But if you want to explain that existence of that own contingent thing, I think that own independent contingent thing could very well explain themselves, all of them. I mean, I don't think there is a logical barrier over there.
I think
It's just that you have too many contingent things explaining themselves. Maybe, I mean, if you want to bring then what is that? Occam's razor, maybe. Then probably this would fail, probably. But then, who says Occam's razor has to be always appreciated? I don't know. Maybe you guys will put more thought on it.
to me it sounds like the Muslim wants to invoke this, like some implication such that if a set S is necessary, all elements S in S are necessary. I think that's what he's attempting to invoke.
No, that was the earlier argument, which to circumvent that problem. I agree. I think from the dependency contingency, I think that should follow basically, right? I think we discussed that earlier. But they came to this conclusion that uh, this set of contingent entities basically, or beings, is necessary, and then from that point on, I forgot what your question was.
It just sounded like he's trying to say that if a set is necessary, all elements in S are necessary.
A set of elements that is necessary, has all its elements necessary. You're saying that I think, yeah, one way to look at it could be that. I think we dealt with that earlier as well, right? I mean, wouldn't I mean, if you have to set aside that argument, maybe even if we jump onto this argument from our perspective, even if let's say God exists, aren't we all necessary basically? I mean, everything that's happening, can we say that that's necessary? I mean, then if he started off taking us as contingent and reached up to God, and if God is necessary, then maybe everything has to be necessary, probably falling down, unless until he smuggles somehow,
Oh
that
yeah.
free will argument, basically, right?
Yeah, this is
And
sort of
that's what he does
Grandpappy's
there, basically.
approach.
Yeah, that's what he does.
Like it's
there.
like when you get to God, you're gonna have to bite the same bullets. Like he's saying, if everything's necessary, that's pantheism. Okay, well, did God necessarily create? If so, pantheism.
Yeah,
Did God not
then becomes,
necessarily create? What's the principle of sufficient reason that explains why he created this, like he actualized this world? And they're going to have to appeal to either mystery or brute contingency, which is sort of the problem they're attempting to use to beat other people over the head with.
right. Madan, you want to add something, or to the at
No,
least the content of that video, or even
yeah.
to
So
what we?
I think all this is such talking at such a level of abstraction that it's just irrelevant now to the point. Well, set of what? At this point, they're just trying to say they're trying to talk about entities that they've not really described or defined or explained, right? And that's kind of that. I think that's kind of the problem with these sort of philosophical conversations, right? What are they talking about? You know exactly here, right? A set can't contain. So if if a contingent set is necessary, right? But I think the best way to kind of deal with this is actually then talking about what we're specifically talking about, right? And then differentiate between that and a theistic explanation. Just like, for example, you have on theism, you have a set of his attributes, God's attributes, or something like that, right? And on maybe on a naturalistic universe, you have a set of certain entities, and then trying to figure out maybe like an Graham Oppie type of way to kind of using the theoretical virtues of what as a good explanation to figure out which one is more viable at this point. But at this point, they're talking at such an abstract level that it's not making much sense. I don't know if you guys are finding the same problem with that.
Oh, okay. I think. Well, I mean, it is a bit technical, but I think I can try to follow what they're saying. They're saying, I don't like the way they're saying the set of all contingent things. What they should say is like the set of all things. And does that set of all things include anything necessary?
I think they have to smuggle that argument this way because that serves their purpose. I mean, they want to reach to a necessary existence, basically, and they can't include that necessary. They can't include everything, basically. Then they run into that Russell's paradox, basically, right?
Oh yeah, it's like essentially because it's like because on the contingency worldview, everything is contingent. Which, like, let's say it's not that there is no necessary thing, and then they're saying, well, what about all of it? And then it's like, well, is that thing contingent or necessary? Which, well, it's like you're sort of like putting the set in itself, maybe depending. I mean, it's really unclear. I wish they would like write this out exactly what they're trying to say.
Exactly. So that's what my problem is. Exactly what they're trying to say, because what are they actually meaning by set of what? When you figure out what we're talking about, then you might be able to articulate it. Until then, it just sounds very vague.
It is very vague.
Yeah, that's how it seems to me. I don't think too many philosophers even sit around thinking about this.
Right.
You know?
I think what we have done is we have dealt in with such a this is where we have gone is a complex thing to think through, and that's why we have lost almost all the audience pretty much.
I think I see the problem is they're jumping from a causal chain to an explanatory chain because there is no
they're
causal...
jumping from a dependency chain to an explanatory chain.
Right, because there's...
So they're dealing with that. I think you probably missed listening to us. I mean, this part where we talk basically.
Because they're asking two different questions. Because if they're asking like what causes the set of all these contingents, it says nothing. This one explains this one. This one causes this one. Causes this one. Causes this one. There is no grand causal that causes all of them. So the answer to the first question would be nothing. The answer to the second question, well, what explains it? That question could be I don't know. But this is definitely two different questions, I think, being asked.
Right.
Okay, what if I ask them? I don't know if there's I think it's a different question, but I heard that someone asked this question from Mohammed Hijab and Sabur once. And the question was, is the set of all things necessary or contingent? Is the set of all things that exist?
Yeah, that's the Russell's paradox, right? Because if it's necessary, then it has to contain the necessary being as well. That's what they think.
Yeah,
basically,
and
right?
that is
Yeah.
actually, I mean, when it's
Yeah.
when the question is set of all things
Because
that exist,
you
it
just can't
includes
resolve
God
that. You just
or
can't
whatever the
resolve
first
that,
cause
basically.
is. So it includes that.
Yeah. So you just can't. I mean, that you just can't resolve that question pretty much. I think.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, see, these are problems, as Mahadan said. I think these are problems extremely tickling to your gray matter. But they probably, I mean, no matter how much you try and how many hypotheses and whatever you reasonings you come up with, they probably have very feeble impact on the reality. Probably very little impact, I would say. I mean, you just can go on, armchair thinking for how much ever long you want to, but then you probably just are, missing it
Yeah,
altogether.
I don't think the case for God.
Can be
I think
resolved by armchair.
well,
You're
no,
saying.
what I would say is I think these sort of arguments is suggestive that this is not a good case for a God, that or God doesn't exist, because do you really think God wants us to learn about Himself through this? Like
Yeah, that's for God. I mean, you're
this sort
setting
of has
aside
to be.
one sort of a God, basically a
Yeah,
kind of God who would want people to know Him, basically, right?
yeah. What
That
is
kind
this?
of a God would be avoided. Yeah.
Yeah, because this
But
is
it
just
can pretty much be done by a God who's extremely uh, complex, or just wants to hide himself from
yeah. It could be yeah. It could be
all
like an
sorts
evil
of 99.9999% of the
yeah,
population,
or
except for a few
it could be like a
few
philosophical.
Hakim type of people,
Yeah, it could be like a philosophical God who wants to play a philosophical prank on us, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
reality is, the type of God that most, the Christian God or the
Yeah, I
even
mean,
the Islamic God.
world's 99.99% of the population is in hell, except for maybe chosen few who are
Yeah,
staying
because
up late at night just doing nothing, maybe.
yeah, I mean, if you look at it from the perspective of a Christian God, and maybe this is like a divine hiddenness type of argument. I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
would God really want to reveal Himself in or make Himself known, if you want to call it, if you don't want to use Christian language, in this
Right.
sort of hair-splitting kind of philosophical, technical ways of thinking about things, where you by through a little bit, tiny bit of a margin of realization, tiny margin of realization, a eureka moment of, oh, wait a minute, oh, it has to be a God through this deductive argument,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's very fine. There's a fine line between these arguments and its conclusion, right? Like a little bit of a difference in perspective can get you to a different conclusion, because it's
Right,
so
right.
muddled in definition and obscure language and abstract thinking. I really don't think this is. I think arguments of this type, the fact that you have to bring it out, I think you can make an argument through a divine hiddenness type of lens, where you make, or a problem with evil type of lens, even, where you would say that this is evidence for that decreases the probability of a Islamic or a Christian God.
Or Christian, yeah, Abrahamic God altogether,
Yeah,
in a
the fact
sense.
that you have to argue in this way, because it's just so difficult. Because Russell paradox, I mean, it's difficult to really kind of, it's one of those things in philosophy that mind boggles you, and you don't know the answer to. There's many things in philosophy that are like that. When I studied philosophy, there was a course called the unsolved problems in philosophy, right? Now, if you borderline using arguments that go near unsolved problems of philosophy, and then start
You mean the whole philosophy then, I guess?
yeah, a lot of philosophy is unsolved.
I think that was the I think it would cover everything in philosophy.
Yeah.
Because I
Like the
think
problem-
there are
not-
almost
yeah.
everything is unsolved.
Right. Well, some people differ. I think certain things are. I personally think there's certain things that are, but in the grand scheme of things, in a worldwide sense, there isn't that sort of consensus, right? If you think about it, unlike other fields. So yeah, I do think that if a premise in your argument rests on something that borderline something unsolved, and that's that we have different perspectives, that decreases the credence that we can give to it. And I think theists should therefore be more humble about it, right? Like this, in this situation, you can make arguments from both sides, and there's not much between them. The arguments, it's just a matter of perspective, and I don't really think that is something that God would be. I mean, they can always say that this is just one way to God, right? That's what I can imagine them saying that, right? Well, no, this is just for the intellectuals, right?
No,
God
I think I have tried this now then quite a few times by going into these Dawah streams basically, right? I have been to almost all the major Dawah streams or places. I mean, these arguments are not for them basically, right? Once they have crossed that line of belief basically, right? Then these arguments don't affect them. And I've heard muftis telling Muslims that once you are in the fold of Islam, there's no room for question. You can't change your mind. I mean, if there is a point when you have a doubt, then 100% that thing you have a doubt about is wrong. Quran is right, Islam is right. You just can't. It's Hotel California basically. You can check out, what is it? What's that line? I don't know who remembers that song, right? You can check out anytime, but you can't leave, or something like that, right? You just can't leave basically, right? And so for them at that point, you just can't leave. Their arguments change from that point on. So these are just maybe superficial to show, non-Muslim that you have so much philosophical depth and you can become, this is what, religions rest on, and in particular Islam among all the religions is superior because there are so deep philosophical arguments for it, but then they just don't adhere to it themselves basically once you are in. I mean, what you pointed out is a very good argument. Somebody from within the Islamic framework could go through these arguments and come to a different conclusion that, I think that God, and probably I think all of us, at least all four of us on this panel right now, would concede that fact that these arguments don't compel us to become Muslim, pretty much, right? And then if some Muslim does that, listening to these arguments and comes to a conclusion that no, these are not convincing enough for me, he just can't do that. That's not in the menu pretty much for him or her, right? All right,
Yeah.
we have logical philosopher.
I mean, I think I can kind of, after reflection and reviewing some modal ontological arguments, what he's trying to say is there's a bunch of contingent things, and they say, well, there's two questions. What causes these things? Nothing. They're causally connected to each other. Nothing causally explains them all. But if you ask what explains them all, you have three options. Either nothing explains it, in which case it's just a brute fact. If something contingent explains it, then it's self-referential because you're taking the set of all contingent things and saying what explains it, and then what explains it is in that set. So it would explain itself, and you could argue that it's necessary, or whatever
But there's no
explains
contradiction. There's no contradiction
I
in
don't think there's an issue with
contingent
that,
things explaining themselves. Yeah.
Yes. So
I don't think there's a. Yeah.
It might be a problem in language of how we're looking at it, but I don't see any problem with contingent things.
Yeah. I mean, contingent
so
things
if
existing
contingent-
by themselves and explaining themselves as well. I don't find that to be a huge problem as well.
Okay. Okay, then you have to accept that.
You probably, I think buck has to stop somewhere, basically, right? For them, it stops at, God. And for God as well, I mean, there's so many things they just can't explain. Basically, we just don't ask those questions, those sort of questions, basically. Where do these attributes come from? Why an attribute of this rather than this attribute? They just don't have an explanation. I mean, just take omnibenevolence pretty much. Why is it not omni-malevolence, right? I don't think they have an answer for that. I mean, they'll definitely make up an answer, but they don't have an answer for it. So that's what I'm saying. I mean,
if you have a series of so again, what we need to be clear whether we're talking about modal, whether we're talking about dependency.
Yeah, because
if it's a dependency thing, then I think one of the ways you can say that the chain has to have something that begins is like a Kalam cosmological type of, you can't have an infinite regress of events. If it's a modal one, then you could say that even if the chain has lots of contingent things, each one before it being contingent, explaining the subsequent, each contingent thing has another contingent thing before it that causes it, and that contingent thing has one before it as well, ad infinitum. Yeah. Then if it's the modal one, you can still say why does the set exist? What's the explanation behind it? Because I can conceive it to be not existing or being different. So if it's like a contingent series of events, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, why is it A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H instead of H, J, Q, Y, in that order? And you can make, you can make that through modal thinking, but you can't do it through, I don't think you can do that through the dependency. The dependency one, you'll have to make an argument from needing to terminate the chain at a beginning, because you can't have an infinite regress of backward events or something like that.
And who says the dependency can only terminate at one? Why can't it terminate at many?
Yeah, it can be just 2 causes or something, or 3.
Yeah,
but
why can't it terminate at many, basically, right? Anyway, logical philosopher.
Yeah. How are you, everybody?
Good.
Yeah. So I would like to point out that this contingency argument is basically based on PSR, which is principle of sufficient reason, that everything must have some reason. But when we go in the quantum realm, so we see that this PSR doesn't actually directly follow that. This is not something which is a law. But this is something which we have observed in multiple ways. But in quantum tunneling, we see that there are probabilities. It's not any deterministic cause there. So PSR applies on classical sense, but we cannot necessarily apply PSR on the quantum level. So that is one thing on the contingency. And yeah.
No, I agree. I think we did talk about this earlier. I think you probably joined in late. Yeah.
Yeah. And another thing is the universe could have been different, so it's contingent. Maybe the universe is the one thing that can we don't have an evidence to say that, basically.
No, you're mixing up a thought experiment. You could conceive, basically think of it as an ontological, a sister of ontological argument, basically, right? You could conceive of universe being different, basically. And that's how this, this contingency argument, modal contingency argument starts, basically, right? You could conceive it to be something else, basically. And it falls into different problems as well. I think maybe Madan and Khali or Howdy are going to explain it better. But, you could conceive there to be not a God, basically, whatever necessary thing. I mean, that's how I see it as well, right? I mean, it's conceivable, at least in theory, basically.
But they would like to say that it's not Yeah, so they would like to say that although you can conceive a universe not existing or the universe being different, therefore they didn't have to exist. Therefore, something necessary must have existed, and that necessary thing must exist on all possible worlds. And the best explanation for that necessary thing is a God, because God is the type of being that will exist in all possible worlds. That's where it gets difficult for them, because I think because they need to show why God is that sort of concrete anchoring thing that will exist in all possible worlds, and they may wish to say that everything else can be different and can be, whereas God can't. I think they say that's how they kind of get to the properties of God, because they would say, well, if it was this kind of very specific thing, it could be different. God is not this very specific thing. It's so let's say you say it's a particle with this X amount of force. Well, that force could have been a little bit more, a little bit less. So I can conceive it being different. So you keep adding a bit more to it, the force, and you add a bit more to the force, and you maximize it out to infinity. And then you maximize everything out to infinity, and eventually you get to something like a God, right? And now you've got something concrete and anchoring, because you've got something infinite, and voila, you've got infinite power, you have infinite being, infinite existence, and that can't change, according to them. Now you can't conceive of that being different on any other possible world, right? Or something like that, and that's why they can't get the conclusion that God must exist, because he's the best candidate for a necessary being, or has more explanatory depth if they want to go down that route. I don't think any of that really works at all, because it doesn't matter if you get to a very, very non-specific creature, right? Non-specific thing, because even if you get to something very, first of all, God is still very specific. I don't think Allah is still very specific, as Kylie's mentioned, as we've mentioned. He's good. And that's very different. That's still distinct from bad, right? And so, why is God good rather than bad? How do you get this? So it doesn't really make sense to think God is this non-specific thing. But even just taking God into account, I mean, you can still change it. You can still conceive it being different. So if you maximize all of his qualities out, you can still say, why is it I can conceive of another being with just a little bit less power? So it just doesn't make sense. At this point, it just becomes so murky. It just falls apart for me in my head. I don't know if you guys have the same problem.
No, I agree. I think I agree. I mean, there's so many. I would say it's almost like you can have infinite ways in which you can conceive of a God. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that. I think you can conceive it in infinite different ways, pretty much, right?
Well, I guess what's sort of the Achilles heel to these type of arguments is essentially any version of religion could run it, so it's not discriminatory. You see what I'm saying?
Right. True that. But then the contingency stage 1 is just a generic, necessary being, basically, right? But our question is, and what we are contesting, it even that has problems, pretty much, right? I mean, yeah.
Like if you introduce a God with finite power, a creature, and you propose that to be the candidate for the necessary being, and it's a finite power, the argument would be that you can think of it being different because it's very specific. Something that is finite, why is it like that instead of the other way? Finite finitude, something being finite means it has limitations. It has an ability to be different, right? If you're like Zeus type of God, he could have been different. Whereas they think for some reason an Allah type of God couldn't have been different. Something like that.
Mahaden, to counter these problems, there were some problems, and especially in Islamic theology, that omni, the omni tag has been removed, basically because it was having some problems, the clashes in between free will and omniscience, basically, right? So free will is clashing with omniscience, so they had to remove that omni thing, basically. They said no, maximally knowable, or maximally powerful, and maximally this or that, right? But then again, what the problem you are saying that applies to that, why this than that, arbitrary limits, basically, right? The problem of, yeah. So yeah, too many problems, I think.
Well, what's funny is if they say it's arbitrary, one thing that's not arbitrary is it could be zero. So you could have like sort of a Socrates, like a solipsistic god who doesn't really know or do anything, but he just exists in order that all these other things can exist. And that's not arbitrary, but
no, why call it God then?
yeah.
Yeah, that's just like a definitional thing, probably, maybe. Anyways, gents, logical. Unless you have anything to add, I would say we are, touching to our mark. It was good, Howdy, to for you to drop in, and definitely you can join in whenever you get a chance. Maybe like, subscribe, and share, I would say, and you can press that notification bell so whenever we are streaming, you can come and join us. And any closing remarks, logical?
Yeah, just one closing remark on the infinite chain thing. Ki unnecessary being must stop the chain of explanation, but the modern cosmology offer a models like loop, quantum cosmology. So these kind of models offer us and offer to resolve this problem. And
Yeah, there
where
are
there
quite a
is
few models. There are almost like
yeah
5, 6, 7, 8 models which
yeah
don't posit a starting of the universe, right?
yeah. So
They
there
are
is no
eternal,
first
and
call required there.
yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, true that, true. Good. Yeah. Howdy, any closing remarks?
No, I guess one thing that I mean, I'm not saying like no arguments. What I want to say would take a lot of time, so I'm going to say maybe next time.
All right.
But thanks for
Yeah.
having
So
me on. Yeah.
you know what you need to do. You need to go subscribe, and share. This is
Howdy,
your first
what's
time.
your, Howdy,
Yeah.
before Philo, you go. Howdy, what's your ethnic background?
I guess I'm Caucasian.
All right. Are you an ex-Christian?
I think I grew up around it. Maybe when I was like a child, I presumably was Christian. And I was atheist, and now I'm agnostic, but I've taken a renewed interest in Christianity. It's fun.
All right. Yeah. Kylie, are you there?
Kelly, are you there? We can't hear you even if you're saying anything. Yeah. All right, Madan. Shall we close in? Unless until you have anything to add, I'll just sit down. I'll just go through my regular grind towards the end of the stream. Anyone who's going to listen to it, not too many listening to us. Basically, I think whenever you talk about deep philosophy, unless until you are someone like, Alex O'Connor or maybe even Joe Schmidt, I think, people are not going to come and listen to you. Maybe, of course, I would concede to the fact that those guys are pretty good and we are average Joes, basically. But anyway, whoever listens to it and finds any meat in our conversations, and if they want to support us, they can go and support us on our Patreon link, which is patreon.com/philosapiens, buymeacoffee.com/philosapiens, or maybe through any of the YouTube channels, super chats, whatever memberships and all those things that are there. And if you're not able enough to support us, the biggest support is to just like, subscribe, and share, comment underneath the video clips or streams. And if you go to these apologist streams, maybe just take our name and say, okay, these arguments have been refuted or have been tackled in Philosapiens channel. And with that, thank you, everybody, and howdy, Madan, Kelly, thanks for dropping by. All right, good night.
Take care.